What does that do?
Allow movement.
Causes movement. So what's a contraction?
Movement.
No. Contraction causes movement. So what's a contraction?
Muscle expanded.
Yeah, what do we call that? You don't want to say shrink.
Get bigger.
No, definitely
Shrink?
not. No.
Like,
But you're making this. What is this? What is this?
so it's like, yeah.
It gets smaller. It doesn't get smaller, it gets shorter.
Oh, yeah.
It goes from being this length to this length, and then back to this length. It gets shorter, not smaller, shorter. It's an important concept. That's what muscles do. Muscles cause movement. How do they cause movement? Through contraction. What's a contraction? Shortening of the muscle. Because when the muscle is attached to two different things here, that muscle becomes shorter, it is going to pull those ends closer together, which means whatever's here and here is going to pull closer together. That's what muscles do. Over 700 muscles in the human body, we're not going to learn them all. That's a lot of muscles. Muscle associated with a particular part of the body is what we refer to as musculature. Now there's three types of muscle in the body. There's skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is under conscious control. In other words, if you want to move your foot, you can move your foot. If you wanted to turn your head, you can turn your head. If you wanted to take your drink off of the table, you could do that using muscles. You see, that's what muscles do. They cause movement. Yeah, it's just like that. Skeletal muscle is under conscious control. Skeletal muscle is aligned in the same direction, so that when those muscles contract, they'll contract at the same time, or they lose in the same direction. And when we look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, we see these striations, these stripes running across it. I'll show you that in a little bit. Cardiac muscle is found where? If you had to guess, in my heart, and in your heart, in all of our hearts, in our heart of hearts, we find cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle in the heart is unique. First of all, it is under involuntary control, so you don't have to think about making your heart beat, which is lucky for most of us, because we would forget. Cardiac muscle is also striated. It also has those stripes running across it, as we'll see a little bit later on. And cardiac muscle is unique in a couple of ways. One of those ways is that it is a branched muscle cell. So you can kind of think of this as a bunch of branched muscle cells sort of interwoven, almost like baskets. And that way, when one cell gets the signal to contract, and the one next to that gets the signal, and the one next to that gets, and they all sort of contract at the same time, causing that area to contract. Smooth muscle is also under involuntary control. It is called smooth muscle because when we see it under a microscope, I'll show you this in a little bit later on. When you see it under a microscope, we don't see those striations. It is smooth. Now, smooth muscle is found in the gastrointestinal system. It is found in the respiratory system. It's found in the reproductive system. It's found in the urinary system. It's found, very importantly, in the cardiovascular system. Everyone knows that our heart is our main pump in our body, right?
Yes.
Our heart is our main pump that pumps blood around the body. However, our arteries greatly assist in pumping the blood through the body. So those arteries are tubes that blood flows through this way. Look up here, not down there. Blood flows through this way, and then it contracts like this to pump the blood forward. Our arteries. So our heart is our main pump, but as blood goes through our arteries, there's a bunch of muscle in the walls of those arteries that creates this unidirectional flow, this one-way flow. And that is an incredibly important part as to when it comes to pumping blood through the body, because if that fails, then the heart has to work harder. And if the heart works harder, it gets bigger. And when the heart enlarges, that's bad because it becomes less effective. So we don't want that. So we'll see smooth muscle in the arteries. We'll see it in the esophagus, in the intestines. We'll see it in the fallopian tubes to help move that egg down. We'll see it in the ureters to help propel urine down from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Smooth muscle is important in that way. All right. Most generally speaking, when we look at a muscle, where you see the bulk of the muscle, we call that the belly. But then, let's see. Muscle does not attach directly to bone. Muscle attaches to tendon, and tendon then attaches to bone. Little cartoon bones. So we have a bone connected to a tendon, connected to a muscle, connected to a tendon, connected to a bone. Bone, tendon, muscle, tendon, bone, in most cases. What we'll see is that when a muscle goes from here to here, it's going to cross a joint. When it goes from bone to bone like this, there's going to be some kind of joint that it has to cross. That means, let's see if I do this right here. Here's our arm and our hand. That bicep brachii muscle that starts up there on the scapula, goes down this way, it's that little bump on the radius like this. When that muscle contracts, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to move one point closer to another point. Well, how do we differentiate between those two? How do we differentiate which part moves closer? Well, there's always one part that's going to move more and one part that's going to move less. The part that moves less, we call the origin. The part that moves more is called the insertion. So, real quick right here. If we have a muscle that looks like this, and it is attached here and here, when that muscle contracts, it's going to get shorter, which means these 2 points are going to get brought closer to one another. This one's going to move a little, this one's going to move a lot. The part that moves a little or none is the origin, the part that moves a lot is the insertion. That's how we differentiate between the two. So when we have this bicep brachii muscle coming down into the radius, we know the scapula is the origin and the radius here is the insertion. So what that means is this point here is going to move closer to this point. But it's not going to slide that way because there's a hinge. So instead what's going to happen is something like this, right? So it's going to move the arm up this way. Does that make sense? Go from 180 degrees to 90 degrees.
What's the red one?
This?
On the radius?
Bicep brachii muscle.
Okay.
This muscle. I said this before. For most every muscle we have in our body, there's going to be a muscle that's going to do the opposite. Remember, when the muscle brings the arm up this way, we don't want to spend the rest of the day walking around like this until somebody comes along and says, hey, can I bring your arm down for you? We won't be able to bring it down ourselves. So for pretty much every muscle in the body that does something, we're going to have a muscle that does the opposite. And that kind of makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when this muscle here is contracted, the opposite muscle has to be relaxed. When this muscle here is contracted, the opposite muscle has to be relaxed. They can't both be working at the same time, otherwise they'd be pulling against one another, which would be bad.
So is that the purpose of the origin and the insertion?
Now the origin is just a basic term, general term, meaning the part that moves less as compared to the part that moves more. And you can kind of see this in the shape of the muscle. You'll be able to look at a muscle and know that when it pulls, it's going to pull something this way rather than pull something that way. And it will kind of make sense when we see some of these. I'll show you. Fascia. I was explaining fascia as being like saran wrap goes around the muscle and sort of becomes part of that tendon. Helps keep everything wrapped up nice and neat. So it's a protective outer layer. A bursa, we talked about this a little bit in medical terminology. A bursa is that pocket of fluid. Remember I was using the rotator cuff as an example, where we have a whole lot of muscles, tendons, and a whole lot of ligaments to allow our arm to move like this. But that means There's a lot of things there that could rub against each other and cause friction. So in some of those areas, we're gonna have this extra pocket of fluid called bursa, or bursae is plural, to decrease that friction. The aponeuroses, I will show you later on. The aponeuroses is a bunch of interwoven thin tendons that the muscles use as attachment site. We see it in the abdomen. We see it a lot in the scalp. So I'll show you that a little bit later as well. Then, we talked about this a little bit already. If I bend my fingers like this, you have to look up here to see this, the demonstration cannot be seen from this here. If I bend my fingers like this, where are the muscles located that pull my fingers down? Right here. And where are the ones that are going to extend my fingers? Here. So when these muscles contract, they pull them up. When these muscles contract, they pull them down. Well, all those tendons that run right up through here, go to each fingertip, run right through this space. And there is a band of tissue that wraps around our wrists and our ankles to keep all those tendons in place. Because otherwise, when we do this, they would all just sort of pop out. And we don't want that to happen. So there's a band of tissue called the retinaculum, or as I call it, God's bracelet, around the wrists and around the ankles that keeps those tendons in place. Except for one. In fact, if you do this with your wrist, and you touch the tip of your pinky to the tip of your thumb, if you do this with your wrist, there you go, and you touch, if you do this with your wrist, and you touch the tip of your pinky, if you do this with your wrist, if you do this with your, this way, that's it, there you go, and touch the tip of your, got everybody doing it, touch the tip of your pinky to the tip of your thumb, what you'll see is this, I don't know what that means. You'll see this little tendon pop out here. It's called the palmaris longus. It's the only one that is not underneath that retinaculum. You see it pop out?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a bone. Where? Are you flexing your wrist?
Well,
Or are you extending your wrist? Don't freak out if you don't have one. About 5% of the population doesn't have one. Flex your wrist.
What do you mean?
This is flexing, this is extending.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's that popping out right there. Touch you, you feel it. There you go. Okay. And your sleeve covered. Oh my God, I can see it from here. You can see it from space.
What?
Palmaris longus. Okay. So retinaculum wraps around all those with that one. On page 37 of the notes, if you happen to have the notes in front of you, remember they're not necessary for success in this course. They're really often convenience. Similar information we found in other textbook and reference materials. Where's my fancy towel? Someone has liberated my fancy towel.
Probably gonna wash it, I hope.
It's so good. Dirty. All right. People freak out when they see these names of them. Seriously? Why did you do that? When people see the names of these muscles, they freak out because they're in Latin, and that freaks people out. Names are long. Remember the muscle that does this?
Mm-hmm.
What's the name of that muscle?
That's what it's called. Is that one? I don't know.
I'm no longer demonstrating the muscle, I'm just making this face at you.
Snake face? That's all. You gotta do snake face muscle.
Levator labii superior alipine size.
Libatory,
labii,
labia,
superior,
superior,
aliquot,
aliquot,
nasi,
nasi.
also known as the Elvis muscle.
I was about to hear.
In the history of Elvis impersonations, I gotta be honest with you, that was probably the worst I've ever heard in my life.
Thank you very much.
There should be some kind of special law created. So, when people see the names in Latin, they freak out. I'm telling you, don't freak out. Here's a perfect example. The muscle called the flexor hallucis brevis. Flexor hallucis brevis. What is the hallux? The big toe. So what does this muscle do to the big toe? It flexes it. So to give you an idea, look up here for a moment, please. Thank you very much. This right here is flexing, this is extending. This is flexing, this is extending. This is flexing, this is extending. So what does this muscle do to the big toe? Flexes it. So in the name flexor hallucis brevis, we know that this muscle does this. Now there's something else in the name, brevis. Brevis means short. This is the short muscle that flexes the big toe. Now why would they go through the trouble of calling this the short muscle that flexes the big toe unless,
It's not really big.
no. Why would they call it the short muscle that flexes the big toe? Because there must be a long muscle that flexes the big toe. So this flexor hallucis brevis says that this is the short muscle that flexes the big toe. And just in that name, you know, since it's the short muscle that flexes the big toe, that there must be a long muscle that flexes the big toe. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But you know something else.
What?
You know something else. You know that you don't want to walk around all day with your toe bent like this. So if your toe is always bent like this, that's going to be uncomfortable. You know that you're going to have some kind of muscle that's going to do what? Extend it. So there's got to be some kind of extensor digitorum muscle. And there it is. In other words, extending the digits. So all that information comes from that. Pardon me for just a moment. And I would expect it to be some of those some. Okay, sorry. Movements. You can see this in your textbook. You have it in your textbook next year. I think it's like page 178. I believe it's 178. Is that right? The movements? Body movements? People moving in pictures?
Yeah.
Well, not really moving in pictures. They're photographs of people who have moved, but it looks stopped now because it's a photograph and not a video.
We're all here, like, like there's no talking about. No. I guess not. What?
You mean Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of the man?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not really demonic. That's
Well, it is
art.
what it is,
is
okay?
what it is.
Creepy.
You're creepy. All right, look at these movements. Flexion and extension. We just talked about some flexion, didn't we? We said that some flexion looks like this, and the extension would be this. Flexion looks like this, extension would be this. Flexion looks like this, extension looks like this. Flex your neck for me. Forward. Now extend it back. There you go. See, flexion, extension. Got it? You understand? There you go. See, it makes you nod. Yes, I understand. Now you'll notice under flexion I've included dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. This is specifically the feet. So to dorsiflex the feet, the toes go up this way. To plantar flex the feet, the toes go down.
Planting.
Yeah, well, planting your toes. Because if you plantar flex your feet, your heels come up off the ground. If you're sitting down like this, and you dorsiflex your toes, they're gonna point up this way. If you plantar flex your toes, they're gonna point down towards the plants. Dorsiflex up to the ceiling, plantar flex down towards the plants. But if you're standing and you plantar flex, it's gonna put you up on your
Oh,
tippy toes.
why?
What do you
You
mean,
can
why?
dorsiflex like that, up. If you do it like that, it's like doing a hook.
How do you plantar flex your feet without going up on your toes?
So, alright, when you sit down,
Lean forward.
it's the opposite, basically.
No, it's exactly the same, basically. It's literally the same.
But it don't look the same.
Yes, it does.
Do it again, please.
I do not want to. If I'm sitting down, I dorsiflex my.
If
Who
it's
forgot to
Jesus,
turn their phone
hang it
up?
up.
Why are you looking at me?
It's
Some-
from over there.
It's him.
Who is it?
You.
You know what? I don't even want to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, I wanna see it.
Sorry.
Did Shawty call you?
I don't know who.
Did Shawty call you?
I don't know who that is. Dorsiflex the feet. Stand up,
Yes.
because I want you to see this. 'Cause you're
Yeah.
not seeing it. Dorsiflex the feet. Feet go up this way.
Mm-hmm.
Plantar flex.
Yeah.
Feet go down this way. Look at that. You just went up on your toes.
Yeah, so.
Yes. Dorsiflex.
Mm-hmm.
Plantar flex. Dorsiflex. That's Michael Jackson. Just like that. Got it?
Dorsal is up.
Dorsiflex, not dorsal, dorsiflex.
Dorsal.
Dorsiflex.
Dors.
Plantar flex.
Dorset.
Yeah. Dorsiflex.
Like
Do
Dorsum.
you like Dorsey?
Dorsiflex.
But not quite an E. Or an A.
Dorsiflex.
Or an A.
Dorsiflex.
Right there.
Yes.
You got it.
And then
Plantarflex.
plantar flex.
Planter.
Yeah.
Plantarflex.
Plantar flex.
Dorsiflex. Plantarflex.
Yes. Oh.
Cool.
All right, look at the next two, abduction and adduction. You'll notice I'll often use the terms abduction and adduction simply to clarify a little bit more since they sound so similar. Abduction is moving a body part toward the away from the midline, because you abduct. Abduction is moving a body part away from the midline. Abduction, moving a body part away from the midline. Abduction, moving a body part away from the midline.
What did you say?
Abduction,
Wait, say it.
moving a body part away from the midline. Abduction.
Like you get abducted.
Abduction,
away.
abducted. They're moving
Oh, there's
away
one
from the midline. Abduction, moving away from the midline. Like I said, you'll hear me say abduction to enunciate. Adduction,
It's close.
moving it towards the midline. Adduction, moving it towards the midline. Adduction, you're adducting, you're adding them toward the midline. Rotation, what can you rotate? Do you know anything that you can rotate? No, you don't know anything you can rotate, nothing at all.
Your arm.
There's nothing that you can rotate, nothing at all.
Your neck.
Okay, yes. Supination, pronation. Palms. Supination, supination, pronation, pronation. Supination? No, don't do it. Supination, pronation, pronation. Do this. Supination,
Supination.
supination,
Supination.
pronation,
Pronation.
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 Supination, supination, pronation, pronation. Supination, supination, pronation, pronation.
Yes.
Supination, supination, pronation, pronation.
Oh.
It was not that big a deal when it was a big deal. It certainly isn't now. Eversion and inversion. This is with the foot. Eversion puts the big toe on the floor. So the foot goes like this.
Ooh. Oh.
So the foot goes like this. So the foot goes like this. So the foot goes like this. Now you'll notice I have there in parentheses or italices or something. that when that happens, that can cause a proximal fracture of the fibula. Like if somebody jumps out of a tree and lands on their foot this way. That will actually cause the foot to twist like this. The fibula will get pushed upward and break right around here. I think we saw this in a college basketball a few years ago. He went up to get the ball, came down on the side of his foot, everted his foot like this, grabbed his leg here. Why would he grab his leg here? Because that's where the fibula broke. Thing was actually sticking out through the skin some too. Inversion puts the pinky toe on the floor.
I know people that walk like that.
Inversion puts the pinky toe on the floor. They say this is what happens when you're walking down the street in high heels and the heel breaks, your foot inverts. I always say it's like when you're walking down the curb, you're not paying attention and your foot slips off.
Oh, yeah, I hate that.
But-
That's the devil's work.
I'm clumsy like that.
But I don't know if a heel breaks, if it always goes this way or this way. I have no idea. It seems to me it would be a 50-50 chance, but that's what I know. So those are the movements that you need to know about. And if you're not sure what they are, well, you can see them right there in the book. Or you can always check the Google net. See the movements. Yes. Now, I apologize for that. Muscles that you need to know. If I've listed them here, you need to know them. They will not be on a diagram. They will not be on a cadaver. They will be described as you see them here in the notes. So you'll need to know what these muscles are based on how they're described in the notes. Starting with the head and neck. And the first one is the frontalis muscle, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
See.
So, do you remember where the frontal bone is located?
Yes.
Yeah.
You So if you remember that where the frontal bone is located, the frontalis muscle is located right on top. I guess I should spin it around. The frontalis muscle is located right here. Here.
Where you frown at?
Here, up on the screen, as it's coming into view.
Fixing his focus.
What were you saying, Stan?
I said it's fixing his focus.
I'm trying to lay it off. Don't tell me what to do.
Oh my
Here
gosh.
we go.
Okay, so you see those muscles right there?
Yes.
Frontalis muscles. I already talked about these ones. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Biceps brachii, the bicep muscle does this. The tricep brachii does this. The bicep is located anteriorly, the tricep posteriorly. So when the bicep flexes, pulls the arm up this way, which means the tricep has to be relaxed. When the tricep flexes, it pulls the arm this way, which means the bicep has to be relaxed. That makes sense? It does.
Bicep, tricep.
I talked about the brachioradialis yesterday a little bit, big forearm muscle right here. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but these next ones I want you to know at the very bottom of the page. There are a group of muscles here, actually here and here, but there's a group of muscles here that I want you to know. These are called the thenars, these are the hypothenars. Don't worry about the hypothenars, but I want you to know what the thenar muscle is. It's a group of muscles right here that cause the thumb to oppose. These are called the thenar muscles. When you think of the thenar muscles, think of your thumb. When you think of the thenar muscles, think of your thumb. When you think of the thenar muscles, think of your thumb. When you think of your thenar muscles, think of your thumb. Thenars think 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 thumb. Got it?
Good.
Yes? Awesome. Okay. Oh, turn the lights on. Okay. Paris of Troy, not to be confused with Paris of Hilton. I think that's funny. All right, where are we on time? Okay, here we go. So, I want to show you something now. We're going to go into muscle physiology. This is one of the first times we actually get into some serious physiology. So I want you to pay attention to this because it's a little complicated if it's your first time here. Now, in order for a muscle to contract, it has to be told to. And the thing that tells a muscle to contract are nerves. So a nerve has to send a signal down. You'll notice I even left a little area for you to draw this out if you felt so inclined. This is that neuromuscular junction. In order for a muscle to contract, it has to be told to contract. The thing that tells a muscle to contract is a nerve. So we have a muscle here that will be contracting. This is a muscle. So, let's see. We'll put some receptors here. Those are the receptors. We'll put some calcium channels here, here, on the other side. Calcium. Ca++ is, of course, calcium. Okay. So a signal is going to come down. Is going to come down a nerve at lightning speed. The signal coming down the nerve is called an action potential. That's just a fancy word or a fancy term for an electrical signal coming down the nerve. The problem is the electrical signal is not going to do anything to the muscle itself. So there has to be a way for the electrical signal to become a chemical signal, and that's what happens here. When that electrical signal comes down the nerve, it's going to activate calcium channels. Calcium is going to go into the nerve. That is going to release this. This is a neurotransmitter that is going to flood this space. And this neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to come across that neuromuscular junction, that space, and bind to the receptors on the muscle fiber. So all those little dots, that equals acetylcholine. When acetylcholine binds to the receptors on the muscle fiber, the green ones, that's going to cause sodium, Na+, to go into the cell. Something just crossed the membrane, didn't it? which means now the inside of the cell is different than it was before, isn't it? And I told you, when the inside of the cell changes, something's going to happen. In this case, the sodium coming into the muscle cell, muscle fiber, same thing, cell fiber, that's going to cause the release of this stored calcium within the muscle cell. So inside of the muscle cell, we have a trunk that is full of calcium. So when the sodium comes in, it's going to release the calcium within the muscle fiber. What that's going to do is that's going to cause some small ligaments, some small filaments to be moved across a large filament. Now I know that's like, well, I don't know what the hell that means. I'll show you. Imagine if I have a big thick filament here in the middle, and I have little tiny filaments attached to here and attached to here. They're going to get pulled towards the center. Those thin filaments are going to get pulled towards the center. Well, if those thin filaments are attached at the end of this muscle cell, it's kind of an oversimplification, but it's going to get pulled this way, these are going to get pulled this way, that's going to cause the whole cell eventually to shorten, it's going to cause the whole muscle to shorten. That's because of this release of calcium inside of that muscle cell. And that happened because of the sodium that came in. And the sodium came in because the acetylcholine bound to the receptors. And the acetylcholine was released from the neurons, and that goes from the action potential, which was an electrical signal. So here's what happens. Again, in order for a muscle to contract, it has to be told to contract. In order for a muscle to be told to contract, a signal has to be sent to it. In this case, it's an electrical signal. And the electrical signal is going to come down the nerve, but it doesn't go all the way to the end. When it gets right near the end, that activates calcium channels. Calcium comes into the end of the neuron, into the end of the nerve. That's going to cause this stored acetylcholine, this neurotransmitter, to get released across this space. We call it the neuromuscular junction, obviously, neuromuscular, nerve to muscle. It's going to cause that release of acetylcholine across this space. Hold on a second. That's going to bind to the receptors on the muscle fiber. When these receptors have that bound to it, that's going to allow sodium to come into the muscle. The sodium now inside of the muscle is going to release calcium from this inside calcium storage site. That's going to release calcium inside of that cell. When that happens, that causes these thin filaments to get pulled across a thick filament, which causes the whole muscle cell eventually to become shorter. We call that a contraction. Meanwhile, we have a guy over here. His name is cholinesterase, or sometimes called acetylcholinesterase, and his job is to recycle this acetylcholine and bring it back up into the nerves so it can be used again. I want to go through this one more time because I want you to realize what's happening here. In order for a muscle to contract, it has to be told to contract. The muscle is going to be told by a nerve. A nerve sends a signal at lightning speed, very, very quickly. That nerve travels all the way down, that signal, travels all the way down the length of that nerve to the end of the nerve, end of the neuron. It's going to cause calcium to go into the end of that neuron, which is going to release acetylcholine from that neuron across this neuromuscular junction. It's going to flood that space. Acetylcholine flooding that space is going to bind to the receptors on the muscle fiber. The more the binding, the more the contraction will later be. Less binding, weaker contraction. So it's going to flood this space here. Sodium is going to come into the cell. That's going to cause the calcium that we have stored in a trunk inside of the cell to be released inside of the cell. The calcium released inside of the cell causes eventually these thin filaments to get pulled across this thick filament, which will eventually cause the entire cell to contract, which will then cause the cell next to it, and the next to it, and next to it, all the cells contract, which cause the muscle to contract.
So basically.
And that's what we call movement. Does that make sense?
So
Sure, does that make sense?
Muscle.
Does that make sense?
I don't know if I'm understanding. Yes.
I'm gonna throw this. I want you to catch it.
Oh my gosh, okay. Let's find it.
Okay, ready?
Yes.
I'm going to throw it over here. Now, in order for her to catch that, what did she have to do?
She had to have her
Extend
hand
my
out.
arm.
She had to extend her
Well,
arm out.
not just extend your arm,
Yeah, like
because
so bad.
I threw it over this way a little bit. So you had to lean your body this way, which means muscles had to move this way. You had to extend your arms this way. You had to extend your fingers this way. When it came into your hand, you had to close your fingers, and then you pulled it back closer into you. And while it was flying through the air, your eyes were following it. They were tracking it. All of that is movement. All of that is muscle. So for all those muscles to be moving, this is what had to happen. A signal had to come down the nerve at lightning speed, activate calcium channels at the end of the nerve, which causes the acetylcholine to be released from here across this space, which causes the acetylcholine to bind to the receptors on the muscle fiber, which causes sodium to come into the muscle, which causes the intracellular calcium to flood inside of the cell, which causes these thin filaments to slide across thick filaments, which eventually causes the entire muscle to contract. All of that happened in every one of those muscles that quickly.
Oh.
In other words, faster than I can imagine. So if you're sitting there going, I don't understand how it could happen that fast. Good, neither can I. I can't imagine that kind of a speed, but that's exactly what happens. Okay, so now what aren't you understanding?
Basically, this is causing the cells to divide. Is that a
Not
division?
divide, no.
Okay, that's all I was.
It's causing, no, the cells, I just did not make it complete. But if you think of the cells being like this, these little filaments are attached here.
Okay.
They're attached at this end, free at this end. They're gonna get pulled this way, these are gonna get pulled this way. So that's gonna pull the whole end of the cell closer
So it's just
together.
the movement of the cell, not the division.
Correct,
Okay, that's what I was seeing.
yeah,
Okay.
yes.
So is the
Choline,
choline already produced inside of that? Or
yes,
just waiting for the calcium?
yes, it's already there sitting and waiting.
It just
It's
waits
waiting
for the
for
right.
It's already there
Just waiting
sitting
for
and
that
waiting.
signal to come out.
And in fact, it has to be because our muscles are always getting a little bit of a signal to contract.
This is the storage.
There's always a little bit, because there's always a little bit of a signal to contract. Do you know why that is, Sierra? Do you know why the muscles are always a little bit ready to contract? Because you never know when markers are gonna come,
Yeah.
because you never know when markers are gonna come flying at you, right? So your muscles are always getting a little bit of a signal to contract.
Okay, to be ready, so you have to get ready.
Thank
Um,
But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's stored up there, it's waiting for that signal to come down. So this is actually, believe it or not, I know you're looking at this like, this is actually one of the easiest types of physiology in the body to explain and to understand. That's why I like to use this one. Because a lot of the physiology in the body is a little more and more and more and more complicated. This one is kind of straightforward. So it makes it a little easier to understand. The first time I heard it, I'm like, I don't get any of that. And then I started to get pieces of it, and then the more I understood this piece, and then I understood that piece, then it all sort of came together and made sense. But it took a while to get there. Yes.
So once what's the Na again?
Sodium.
Once the sodium enters the muscle, is the sodium and what's the other one? The Ca,
Calcium.
is the sodium and the calcium combined together?
No. All the sodium does is causes this to open up.
Oh, okay, this is like a box.
Yep,
Okay.
it's like a box.
Okay.
That's why it says like a trunk full of
Yeah.
calcium.
Oh, okay.
So, and the reality is the sodium just sort of acts as a continuation of the electrical signal. The electrical signal was up here. Remember, electricity is just a bunch of plus and minuses.
Oh.
So what this is doing is this is just becoming more
A
positive
boost.
inside of the membrane. So it just changes the polarity inside of the membrane.
Okay.
So basically, we have an electrical signal that then transfers and becomes a chemical signal, which then, once inside of the cell, is an electrical signal again.
Okay.
And that electrical signal, being the sodium, that electrical signal is actually what causes that box full of calcium to be released, and calcium floods the space. Got it? All right. Now I'm going to show you some of this stuff in animation. They get a little more detailed. They use a lot more scientific terminology, which is fine if you guys understood this stuff a little bit already. But for people who are learning this for the first time, I don't think that's fair. So